A routine traffic stop turns into a national firestorm when Officer Ray Briggs pulls over NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal for no reason. What starts as an act of racial profiling spirals into an explosive fight for justice, one that exposes deep corruption, sparks nationwide protests, and threatens to tear a city apart. But Shaq isn't just a victim. He's about to turn the tables in a way no one saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The city of Brentwood was a place of contrasts. Skyscrapers stretched toward the sky, casting long shadows over streets filled with both opportunity and struggle. The wealthy thrived in gated communities, while those on the margins fought for every dollar. But in the heart of it all stood Big Shaq, a man who defied every stereotype. A millionaire, a legend, a man of immense stature, yet one whose heart was even bigger than his towering frame. Shaquille O'Neal was a household name, not just for his legacy in basketball, but for his unwavering commitment to the people. While many retired athletes vanished into a life of luxury, Shaq had done the opposite. He stayed in Brentwood, walking among the people, shaking hands with store owners, visiting schools, funding community programs. His presence wasn't just symbolic. It was real, tangible, and deeply felt. Every morning, he followed the same routine. A 5 a.m. gym session, followed by a quiet drive to his favorite coffee shop in the old district. Not the high-end spots where other celebrities gathered, but a small cafe run by an elderly couple, the Wilkins, who had known him since he was just a kid trying to find his way. Shaq would sit at the counter, his massive hands cradling a small coffee cup, listening to their stories about the past, about the city that had changed around them but hadn't changed for them. Despite his millions, he never distanced himself from struggle. He understood what it meant to be overlooked, judged before speaking, seen as a threat rather than a man. Even with all his success, racism was never far away. Sometimes subtle, sometimes blatant, but always present. And Brentwood had its fair share of men who didn't appreciate a black man thriving without their permission. Among them was Officer Ray Briggs, a 32-year-old police veteran with a reputation as solid as a steel wall. Unmovable, unyielding, and to those who knew him best, deeply prejudiced. He wasn't the kind of cop who threw slurs around carelessly. No, he was smarter than that. His racism came in the form of routine stops, unnecessary citations, prolonged searches, and coincidental arrests of black men who fit the description. Shaq had crossed paths with Briggs before, but they had never clashed, yet. Briggs had been watching Shaq from a distance for years, resenting the way people looked up to him. To Briggs, Shaq was a man who had outgrown his place, a man who should have taken his millions and left Brentwood instead of staying and stirring things up. The officer had always believed in unspoken rules. Black men could entertain. They could succeed in sports, but they shouldn't expect to be treated as equals in power. And Big Shaq, in all his charitable influence and unwavering presence, was breaking those rules. Briggs wasn't alone in his thinking. Many in Brentwood's elite circles, old money, powerful figures who had run the city for generations, shared his unspoken distaste. They tolerated Shaq's presence because of his fame, but they didn't embrace him as one of their own. Shaq, of course, was aware of this. He had spent a lifetime navigating spaces where he wasn't fully welcome. He knew the smiles that hid resentment, the handshakes that felt forced, the invitations that were never extended, but he never let it deter him. He focused on those who did embrace him, the single mothers whose rent he covered, the kids who played in gyms he built, the small businesses he quietly funded. Yet despite all the good he did, he couldn't escape the fact that, in the eyes of some, he was still just another black man who needed to be kept in check. A week before everything changed, Shaq was invited to speak at a community town hall, addressing police reform and racial profiling. The event was packed, cameras rolling, reporters scribbling notes as he spoke about the injustices faced by black men in America, even those with power and wealth. Briggs sat in the audience, arms crossed, his face expressionless, but his fists clenched. When Shaq finished his speech, a young black teenager named Dion stood up and asked, "Shaq, do you ever get scared?" Shaq took a long pause before answering. "Scared? I'd be lying if I said no. But fear isn't what defines a man. What you do in the face of it, that's what matters. The audience erupted in applause. Briggs, however, remained seated, jaw tight. Later that night, he filed a report on Shaq's vehicle. Just a precaution, he told himself. Just in case he ever needed a reason. That following morning, Shaq went about his usual routine. The coffee shop, the gym, a meeting about an upcoming charity event. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. But in a dimly lit police station, Briggs was already laying the groundwork for what he saw as a long overdue lesson. As Shaq drove through Brentwood's wealthier district that afternoon, he didn't notice the police cruiser that had been following him for 3 blocks. Didn't notice the way Briggs tightened his grip on the steering wheel, eyes burning with a quiet, dangerous determination. Didn't know that in just a few minutes, his entire world was about to change. The afternoon sun hung high over Brentwood's wealthier district, casting golden streaks across the spotless pavement. It was the kind of neighborhood where driveways were lined with imported cars, where front lawns were trimmed to perfection, and where a man like Big Shaq was an unfamiliar sight. Not because of his wealth, but because of the color of his skin. Shaq wasn't a stranger to these areas. He had driven through them countless times, heading to business meetings, charity events, or just to clear his mind. Today, he was simply on his way home, the deep hum of his custom-built black SUV blending into the silence of the suburban streets. With one hand on the wheel and the other adjusting the radio, he barely noticed the police cruiser that had been trailing him for the last 2 blocks. Then, the flashing red and blue lights filled his mirrors. Shaq's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. He knew the drill. He slowed the SUV and pulled over to the side of the road. He had done nothing wrong, but that didn't matter. Not here. Not with the wrong officer behind him. Through the rearview mirror, Shaq saw the officer step out of the car. Officer Ray Briggs. Even if Shaq had never met him formally, he knew of him. Everyone did. A cop with a reputation for pushing the line but never quite crossing it. The kind of officer who could ruin a man's day, a man's week, even a man's life, and still walk away untouched. Briggs adjusted his belt, taking his time approaching the SUV. His fingers brushed the holster of his gun, not in a way that suggested immediate danger, but enough for Shaq to notice. Shaq took a deep breath and rolled down his window, hands resting clearly on the steering wheel. "License and registration," Briggs said, his voice flat, emotionless. Shaq nodded, moving slowly. "No problem, officer." He reached into the glove compartment, his movements deliberate. Briggs didn't say a word, but Shaq could feel the weight of his gaze, scanning him, assessing him, looking for a reason. As Shaq handed over the documents, Briggs studied them a little too long, his lips pressing together in mock concern. "You in a hurry somewhere?" the officer asked. Shaq kept his tone even. "Just heading home." Briggs cocked his head, his gaze drifting over the SUV. "Nice car. Custom, huh?" Shaq nodded, already recognizing the game Briggs was playing. Casual conversation laced with quiet intimidation. Briggs flipped through the papers. "You live around here?" Shaq raised an eyebrow. That was the real question. "Not far," he answered. Briggs smirked. "Not far, huh? See, we've been getting reports of suspicious vehicles in the area. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Shaq held his stare. "Suspicious how?" Briggs took a step back, looking at the SUV like it was something foreign, something out of place. "You tell me," he said. Shaq let out a slow breath. He had played in arenas packed with screaming fans, stood face to face with some of the most dominant athletes in the world. But somehow, this moment, the quiet tension between him and a cop looking for an excuse, felt heavier than all of that combined. "Step out of the vehicle," Briggs said suddenly. Shaq hesitated for just a second. "What's the reason, officer?" Briggs's eyes darkened. "You resisting?" The words carried a weight, a history, one that Shaq knew all too well. He clenched his jaw but kept his voice steady. "No, sir." He pushed open the door and stepped out, towering over Briggs, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the officer. For a second, the dynamic shifted. Briggs wasn't used to looking up at someone. He wasn't used to feeling small. And for a brief moment, there was something in his eyes. something close to fear, but not quite. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Briggs took a step forward, closing the space between them. His expression hardened, and before Shaq could react, Briggs shoved him, hard, right in the chest. Shaq barely moved, his feet planted firm. But the gesture, the audacity of it, sent a ripple of silence through the air. A few feet away, a woman walking her dog had stopped. A man watering his lawn lowered his hose, and across the street, a teenager with a phone in his hand had started recording. Shaq's pulse drummed in his ears, but he didn't react. Didn't give Briggs what he wanted. Briggs tilted his head, his voice dropping low enough that only Shaq could hear. "What's the matter, big guy? That money make you soft?" Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose, controlling the storm brewing inside him. A few more seconds, and this would all be over. But then Briggs took another step closer. "See, guys like you think the rules don't apply. You think you can just buy your way out of trouble." Shaq's jaw tightened. "I don't think that at all, officer." Briggs smirked. "No? Then why do you look so damn nervous?" By now, more people had stopped to watch. A couple standing near their parked car whispered to each other. A delivery driver on his break held up his phone, recording. Shaq could feel the shift. This wasn't just a stop anymore. Briggs must have noticed too, because something flickered in his expression. Annoyance, maybe even regret. He had expected submission, compliance, maybe a little fear. Instead, he had an audience. The teenager with the phone called out, "Yo, that's Big Shaq. What the hell is this?" Murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. Someone else spoke up. "He's being harassed, man. This is messed up." Shaq saw the briefest flicker of uncertainty in Briggs's face, but it vanished just as fast. The man had gone too far to back down now. He pulled out his radio. "I got a suspect refusing to comply. Might need backup." Shaq closed his eyes for half a second. He knew what was happening. Knew what words like suspect and backup meant in a situation like this. He had a choice. He could argue, escalate, feed into the narrative Briggs wanted. Or he could do what he had done his entire life, stay in control, even when the world wanted him to lose it. Shaq turned his head toward the crowd, toward the kids still recording, the people watching. Then, in the calmest voice he could manage, he said, "I'm not resisting. I just want to go home." Briggs clenched his jaw. For the first time since this began, he was the one losing control. A few seconds passed, then a minute, and then, in the distance, sirens. The situation was about to spiral. Shaq could feel it, and something told him. This was only the beginning. Shaq stood still, his massive frame towering over Officer Briggs. Yet he made no move to resist. His years in the public eye had trained him to handle pressure, to stay calm when the world pushed against him. But this was something different. The sirens grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the windshields of parked cars. More squad cars pulled up, doors swinging open as two additional officers stepped out. Their hands hovered near their holsters, not gripping, not drawing, but ready. The crowd, now nearly 24 people, had begun to murmur, their voices rising in a mixture of concern and disbelief. Several phones were up, cameras rolling, capturing every second. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was something else. Briggs, standing inches from Shaq, smelled the shift in the air. He could feel the weight of the crowd pressing in, their eyes boring into him, their judgment creeping into his skin. He had started this to prove a point, to remind Shaq that no amount of money or fame could protect him from men like him. But now, with the cameras rolling and the tension building, he needed to regain control. Briggs squared his shoulders, turning his voice sharp and authoritative. "You're being detained for obstruction," he announced, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Shaq exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. Obstruction of what? Briggs didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his cuffs. The reaction from the crowd was immediate. Gasps, protests. "Yo, this is crazy," someone shouted. "You can't arrest him for nothing." Another voice chimed in. Briggs ignored them. His grip was firm, unshaking. "Turn around," he ordered. Shaq's jaw clenched, his breathing slow and measured. He had a choice here. He could argue, resist. But that would be exactly what Briggs wanted. He knew the script. He had seen it before. Instead, he did the one thing Briggs didn't expect. He complied. Without a word, Shaq turned, putting his hands behind his back. Briggs wasted no time. The cold steel snapped shut around Shaq's wrists, the sound cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a gunshot. That's when the kid spoke up. A voice, small but strong, pierced through the noise. "Wait! That's Big Shaq!" The words hung in the air, freezing everything for a split second. Shaq turned his head slightly, catching sight of the boy. Couldn't have been more than 10, standing near the curb with his mother, his wide eyes locked on the scene unfolding before him. "He helps our community," the boy continued, his voice rising with urgency. The energy in the crowd shifted instantly. What had been quiet disbelief turned into something else, something bigger. "He built our rec center," someone else added. "He paid my sister's tuition," another voice chimed in. More voices joined in, the outrage spreading like wildfire. Shaq, still in cuffs, turned his gaze toward Briggs. For the first time, he saw doubt flicker in the officer's eyes. The situation had changed. This wasn't just a cop flexing power over a black man anymore. This was Big Shaq, a hero, a pillar of the community. Briggs licked his lips, shifting uncomfortably. He hadn't expected this. He had planned for compliance or defiance, but not public outcry. The officers standing by their cars exchanged uncertain glances. None of them wanted to be in the center of something that could spiral into a national headline. Shaq let out a slow breath, his presence alone doing more than words ever could. He wasn't fighting. The people were fighting for him. The internet explodes. One of the bystanders, a woman in a green hoodie, held up her phone, speaking directly into the camera. "This is happening in Brentwood right now. This man, Big Shaq, is being arrested for no reason. He's done nothing wrong." She turned the camera toward Shaq, then zoomed in on Briggs. The officer's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of the lens, the realization creeping in that this footage would be on a million screens by nightfall. Then came the dreaded words. "We're live." Briggs took a step back, his fingers twitching. He had spent years operating in the gray area of power, just enough force to intimidate, never enough to incriminate. But this was out of his hands now. A voice crackled through his radio, the dispatcher's tone clipped and urgent. "Briggs, what's the status of your stop? We're getting calls at the station. It's trending." Briggs barely heard the response. His face was already turning red. Despite the uproar, the situation had gone too far to de-escalate. The cuffs were already on. The arrest had already been made. If Briggs backed down now, it would be an admission of guilt. He straightened his posture, gripping Shaq's arm just a little tighter than necessary. "Get in the car," he ordered. Shaq didn't resist. He allowed himself to be guided toward the back of the squad car, his head held high, his expression unreadable. The crowd erupted in protest, but Shaq didn't give Briggs the satisfaction of reacting. As the car door shut, Shaq exhaled slowly. The cool leather of the seat pressed against his back, the metallic scent of the handcuffs lingering in the air. Outside, the scene was chaos. More people had gathered. The police radio inside the car chattered frantically with updates about the spreading news. Shaq closed his eyes for a moment. He knew how this worked. The charges would be false. The accusations would be vague. Maybe resisting arrest. Maybe interference with an officer. But the truth was something bigger. This wasn't about a traffic stop. It never was. And now, the world was watching. As the squad car pulled away, Shaq caught one last glimpse of the boy. He was still standing on the curb, his fists clenched, his eyes filled with something Shaq recognized too well. Disbelief. Anger. A lesson learned too soon. Shaq swallowed down the bitterness rising in his throat. He had spent years building something in this city. A legacy, a voice, a force for change. And now, in a matter of minutes, it had been challenged. Not by words, not by debate, but by a badge and a man who thought power meant control. Shaq turned his head and looked out the window as the station came into view. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment Shaq was shoved into the squad car, the world started watching. Within minutes, videos from the scene flooded social media, shared and reshared at an unstoppable pace. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, every platform lit up with outrage and debate. The first post to go viral was a live-streamed video from the woman in the green hoodie. It had over 2 million views in under an hour. Big Shaq just got arrested in Brentwood. No charges, no crime, just being black in the wrong neighborhood. The responses came fast. Thousands of comments filling the screen. They arrested Shaq? The Shaq? Nah, this ain't right. Doesn't matter how rich or famous you are, racism doesn't care. This is disgusting. That cop knew exactly what he was doing. But not everyone agreed. As the video spread, so did the divide. If he did nothing wrong, why did the cop pull him over? Something's missing here. No one is above the law. Even celebrities have to follow the rules. Shaq should have just cooperated. The debate spilled over into mainstream news. Within 2 hours, every major news network had picked up the story. The footage played on CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC, everywhere. Anchors dissected the video frame by frame. Newsrooms buzzed with urgency, trying to get interviews, opinions, expert takes. The narrative split immediately. On one side, the outrage. This is another case of racial profiling. A successful black man, targeted for nothing but existing in the wrong place. On the other, the defense. No man is above the law. We don't know the full story yet. The officer might have had valid reasons. Panel discussions erupted across networks. Heated arguments flared between commentators. Some pointed to Briggs's history, his pattern of targeting black drivers, his excessive force complaints, the whispers about his personal biases. Others insisted Shaq's fame was clouding judgment. Would we be talking about this if he were just another guy? A conservative pundit argued. Celebrity or not, the law applies to everyone. But then came the twist. As the news cycle intensified, Shaq's legal team moved quickly. They didn't just want to clear his name, they wanted justice. His lawyer, David Colson, a sharp, relentless advocate for civil rights, wasted no time. Within hours, his team dug into Officer Briggs's past. And what they found was explosive. A pattern of racially motivated stops, complaints buried in paperwork. At least 5 formal accusations of misconduct, all involving black men, all dismissed due to lack of evidence. Then came the most damning revelation. A case from 6 years ago. A black teenager, Jamal Ellis, was pulled over by Briggs under suspicious activity. No crime, no evidence, just an excuse. When the boy resisted the search, Briggs detained him using excessive force, breaking the kid's wrist. The case never went to trial. The charges disappeared. The officer was cleared of wrongdoing. But now it was all coming back. Colson and his team released the information to the press, fueling the fire already raging online. Suddenly, Briggs wasn't just another cop. He was a symbol of a broken system. Shaq sat on the cold bench, his back against the concrete wall, staring at the barred window near the ceiling. The air inside the cell was stale, thick with the weight of 1,000 stories like his own. Men who had been here before, men who never had cameras to prove their innocence. Despite everything he had built, everything he had accomplished, he was here, in a cell, as if none of it mattered. He exhaled, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been too tight. Across the room, a guard stood watching, arms crossed. He wasn't hostile, but he wasn't friendly either. Bet you never thought you'd end up in a place like this, huh? The guard muttered. Shaq looked up, meeting his eyes. Bet you did, he said quietly. The guard shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. Shaq turned his gaze back to the ceiling. He had spent his entire life proving he was more than just his size, more than just his skin. But in the end, none of it had been enough to stop this from happening. He thought about the kid in the crowd, the way his voice had cut through everything. That's Big Shaq. He helps our community. That kid had believed in him. And now Shaq had to believe in himself, not just to clear his name, not just to get out of this cell, but to make sure this never happened to the next kid watching. By the time midnight hit, Shaq's name was the #1 trending topic worldwide. Celebrities tweeted in support. Athletes, musicians, politicians, even those who usually stayed silent on racial issues, spoke out. LeBron James, This ain't right. We all see it. Dwayne Johnson. This is bigger than Shaq. This is about every black man who's been treated like this when no one was watching. Alicia Keys. Justice for Shaq. Justice for everyone who's been in his place. But not everyone was on his side. Politicians jumped into the debate. Some called for an investigation into police overreach. Others used the moment to push back against celebrity privilege. Senator Mark Calloway, our Texas. Shaq should be treated like any other citizen. If he broke the law, he should face the consequences. Congresswoman Lillian Carter, D. California. This isn't just about Shaq. This is about an entire system that allows officers like Briggs to operate unchecked. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit police office, Officer Briggs sat at his desk, his face pale as he scrolled through his phone. Every news channel had his name. Every major outlet was talking about him. His superiors had already called him in. The police commissioner had ordered an internal review. Briggs had thought he was in control. Now, the walls were closing in. He clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around his phone. This was not how this was supposed to go. Back at the station, Shaq's lawyer finally arrived, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "You're getting out," Coulson said, sliding a folder onto the table. "But this isn't over." Shaq sat up. "They dropping the charges?" Coulson smirked. "Not yet, but they will." He leaned forward. "We're not just clearing your name, Shaq. We're taking this whole damn system down." Shaq looked at his lawyer, then at the cell around him, and for the first time since this started, he allowed himself to smile. Because he wasn't just walking out of here. He was walking out with a purpose. The air in the police station was thick with tension. Shaq sat across from his lawyer, David Coulson, his massive hands folded together on the metal table. The cuffs were gone, but the weight of what had happened still pressed down on him. Outside, the world was still on fire. Protests had started forming, the media was camped outside. And online, Shaq's arrest was turning into a national movement. But none of that prepared him for what Coulson was about to say next. Coulson exhaled, sliding a thick manila folder across the table. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried something deeper, something heavier. "We have a problem, Shaq." Shaq arched an eyebrow, flipping open the folder. Inside were documents, reports, names, things that had nothing to do with his arrest. He looked up. "What is this?" Coulson's jaw tightened. "This isn't just about you. This is bigger, much bigger." Shaq leaned forward, his eyes scanning the papers. At the top of the file, one name stood out. Officer Raymond Briggs. And beneath it, a case from 10 years ago. 2 hours earlier, Coulson had been sitting in his downtown office, exhausted from battling the media and preparing Shaq's defense, when his assistant buzzed in. "There's a man here to see you," she said hesitantly. "Says he has information on Officer Briggs." Coulson almost dismissed it. He had been a lawyer long enough to know that people came out of the woodwork whenever a big case hit the news. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a tip. But then his assistant added something that made him sit up. "He says it's about a cover-up." Coulson narrowed his eyes. "What kind of cover-up?" The assistant hesitated, then whispered, "A hate crime." That was all it took. Minutes later, a man in his late 50s shuffled into the office. His clothes were worn, his eyes sunken, like someone carrying years of secrets. His name was Frank Daly, a retired cop who had once worked with Briggs. Coulson gestured for him to sit. "You said you had information on Briggs," Coulson said, keeping his voice even. "Start talking." Daly nodded, his fingers twitching like he wasn't sure if he should be here. Then he leaned forward. "Briggs isn't just another bad cop," Daly muttered. "He's a protected bad cop. And the people protecting him? They've been doing it for years." Coulson folded his arms. "Who's they?" Daly hesitated. Then he slid an old, crumpled police report across the desk. Coulson picked it up, reading the faded text. And then, his blood ran cold. It was a report from a decade ago. A case where a black teenager had been found beaten nearly to death in an alleyway. The suspect, a white man named Christopher Briggs. Coulson's pulse quickened. "Briggs, as in Ray Briggs?" Daly nodded. His little brother. Coulson's grip on the paper tightened. Officer Briggs had a brother, one who had been accused of a violent hate crime. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the next page, because on it was the original arresting officer's name. Coulson flipped through the file, his legal instincts kicking in. The case should have gone to trial. The evidence was there: witnesses, medical reports, even a confession. But instead it vanished. No charges, no trial, nothing. And Officer Briggs? He had been promoted within a year. Daly sighed. They buried it, covered it up, because their father, James Briggs, was a big name in the police union back then. Coulson clenched his jaw. He had heard that name before. James Briggs had been a legend among cops, a man who had built his career on law and order. But now it was clear. He hadn't just protected the law. He had protected his own. And Ray Briggs? He had learned exactly how the system worked. Daly exhaled. You think what happened to Shaq was random? He shook his head. Briggs was always going to go after someone big. He's been waiting to remind people who's in charge. Coulson closed the file, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a racist cop targeting Shaq. This was about a man who had spent his entire career abusing power and getting away with it. Until now. Back at the precinct, Officer Briggs sat in his office, staring at his phone. His name was everywhere. Headlines, news tickers, Twitter trends. His own department was now reviewing his record, pulling up cases he thought had been long buried. And the worst part? He knew Coulson had something. He had seen the old cop, Daly, walk into Coulson's office. Briggs gritted his teeth. Daly had been there when it happened, back when his brother had been arrested. He had been part of the cleanup, one of the guys who fixed things. If he was talking, that meant trouble. Briggs picked up his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. What? Briggs swallowed. We have a problem. A pause. Then, I saw. Briggs ran a hand over his face. They're digging. Coulson has something on me. Another pause. Then, the voice on the other end spoke carefully. You need to fix this, Ray. Briggs closed his eyes, his mind spinning. How? Silence. Then a slow, deliberate answer. Do what we've always done. Shut it down. At the police station, Shaq's hands curled into fists as Coulson finished explaining. This wasn't about a bad cop targeting him. This was about a man who had spent his career destroying lives and getting away with it. Shaq leaned back, his jaw tightening. So what do we do? Coulson smirked, his lawyer instincts in full gear. We take him down. Shaq exhaled, his chest rising and falling. He had spent his whole life playing by the rules, showing that a black man could be more than just an athlete, more than just what the world expected. But now it wasn't just about him. It was about every kid who would be stopped because of their skin. Every man who wouldn't have cameras filming when it happened. Shaq looked at Coulson and gave a slow nod. Let's end this. As Shaq and Coulson prepared for war, Briggs sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. His whole life, he had been untouchable. But this time, he wasn't sure if he'd make it out clean. His phone buzzed again. A text. Handle it, before it's too late. Briggs swallowed hard. Because for the first time in his life, he was the one being hunted. Brentwood was no stranger to conflict. It had seen its share of protests, of marches and movements, of voices demanding to be heard. But nothing had shaken the city quite like this. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the streets were already alive with outrage. Shaq's arrest had turned into a symbol, another moment in a long, painful history. And now, the people weren't just angry. They were done being silent. By mid-morning, hundreds of people flooded downtown Brentwood, marching toward City Hall. Some held signs. Justice for Shaq and end racial profiling, in bold, unshakable letters. Others simply chanted his name, their voices echoing through the streets. Reporters lined the sidewalks, cameras rolling, documenting the moment. Helicopters hovered above, capturing aerial shots of the growing crowd. At first it was peaceful, organized, focused. But as the day wore on, the energy shifted. A group of masked individuals, faces covered, movements sharp and deliberate, pushed their way to the front. They weren't holding signs. They weren't chanting Shaq's name. Instead, they were looking for chaos. The first clash happened near Pine Street, right outside a bank. A bottle was thrown. No one knew by who. Then another. A trash can was set on fire. A store window shattered. The line between protest and riot blurred in an instant. The police, already on edge, moved in fast. "Disperse immediately," the megaphones blared. Tensions skyrocketed. Protesters pushed forward, cops pushed back. The air turned thick with urgency, with the raw weight of history repeating itself. And watching it all unfold on the news, from the other side of a police station cell, was Shaq. The police station buzzed with nervous energy. Officers whispered in hallways, glancing at their phones. Every screen in the building was flashing images of the chaos outside. When Coulson arrived with Shaq's bail papers, the desk sergeant barely looked at them before processing the release. They wanted him out. Quickly. A few hours later, Shaq stepped outside the precinct, blinking against the afternoon sun. The first thing he saw? A wall of cameras. Journalists swarmed him instantly, microphones shoved in his face. "Shaq, do you have a statement? What's your next move? Are you pressing charges?" Shaq's eyes flickered toward the horizon. In the distance, he could hear the echoes of the protest, could feel the pulse of a city on the edge of something dangerous. He exhaled. Then, instead of answering, he simply walked past the cameras. Because right now, the fight wasn't with reporters. It was with a system that had been broken for far too long. While Shaq was walking free, Briggs was sinking deeper. Inside the Brentwood Police Department, the walls were closing in. His face was everywhere, on the news, on social media, in conversations whispered among his fellow officers. He could feel it, the shift in how they looked at him. He wasn't the untouchable cop anymore. He was a liability. And worse, his superiors were turning on him. The police commissioner, a man who had once defended Briggs without hesitation, now stood in front of reporters, carefully choosing his words. "We take these allegations seriously," he said, his voice neutral but distant. "The department will conduct a full investigation." Briggs watched from his office, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He could see it happening. They were going to throw him under the bus. Unless he got ahead of the story. That night, he sat down with a friendly news anchor, one who had always been sympathetic to law enforcement. He leaned forward, his voice measured, his expression carefully crafted. "This has been a difficult time for me and my family," he began. "I've served this city for years, and I've always done my job with integrity." The anchor nodded sympathetically. "There are people who say this was racial profiling, that Shaq's arrest was unfair." Briggs sighed, shaking his head. "Look, I respect Shaquille O'Neal, but let's be honest, no one is above the law." The words were deliberate, carefully chosen. He was planting doubt, shifting the focus. Was it an unfortunate situation? Yes, but I was doing my job. And just like that, the conversation changed. The headlines the next morning were split. Shaq speaks out on racial profiling. Officer Briggs, no one is above the law. The battle for the truth had begun. Shaq sat in his downtown apartment, watching the coverage unfold. The protests, the violence, the way Briggs was already twisting the narrative. Coulson sat across from him, shaking his head. "He's playing the victim," the lawyer muttered. "And the scary thing? It's working." Shaq's phone buzzed. Another message from a reporter, another request for a comment. He ignored it. Instead, he turned toward the window, looking out over the city. Brentwood was at a crossroads. One wrong move, and this would spiral into something uncontrollable. But if they played it right, if they stayed smart, stayed steady, stayed powerful, this wouldn't just be about Shaq's arrest. This could change everything. Coulson leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What's the move, Shaq?" Shaq exhaled. He had spent his whole life fighting battles on the court. But this was the fight that really mattered. And he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The tension in Brentwood had reached a breaking point. The protests hadn't stopped. The news cycle hadn't moved on. The people hadn't forgotten. And now, it was time for Shaq to speak. It had been a full 72 hours since his release, and in that time, the narrative had been fought over like a battlefield. Briggs had gone on TV, spinning his version of events. He was the dedicated officer unfairly targeted, the man just trying to do his job. The police department had stayed strategically silent, waiting to see which way the wind blew before making a decision. But now, Shaq was done watching from the sidelines. The event was held in the largest conference hall in downtown Brentwood. The room was packed. Journalists, activists, politicians, even celebrities. Shaq sat at the center table, his lawyer David Colson beside him, a stack of thick manila folders in front of them. The air was heavy. Everyone knew something big was coming. Shaq leaned toward the mic, his voice steady. "I want to thank everyone for their support these past few days," he began. "I wish I could say I was surprised by what happened to me, but I wasn't. And that's the real problem." The room fell silent. Cameras rolled, pens scratched against notepads. "This isn't about me," Shaq continued. "It never was. This is about a system that allows men like Officer Briggs to operate without consequences." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Shaq glanced at Colson, giving him a nod. That was the signal. Colson reached for the folders. Colson's voice was clear, sharp. "The man who arrested Shaq, Officer Raymond Briggs, is not just a bad cop. He is a man with a long, dangerous history. And today, we're going to prove it." The first document was a misconduct complaint from 6 years ago. "Jamal Ellis," Colson read, 17 years old, stopped by Officer Briggs for suspicious behavior. No crime committed, no charges filed, but Jamal was detained anyway. Colson lifted his gaze, and by the time his mother picked him up from the station, his wrist was broken. The journalists whispered, some shaking their heads, others already typing. Colson slid another paper forward. "Here's another one. A routine traffic stop in 2015. The driver? A black man named Curtis Bell. He was pulled over for a broken taillight, except his taillight wasn't broken. Curtis was ordered out of his car, searched, and when he questioned why, Briggs arrested him for resisting." A collective murmur of disgust rippled through the audience. Colson wasn't done. He held up one final folder. "This one," he said, his voice dropping into a cold, deadly calm, "is the most important." The screen behind them flickered to life. A case from 10 years ago. Shaq didn't turn to look at it. He already knew what was in there. But the audience? They weren't ready for what they saw. The crime scene photo flashed across the screen. A black teenager, barely 18, beaten and left unconscious in an alley. The suspect? Christopher Briggs, Officer Briggs' younger brother. The arresting officer? Raymond Briggs. And the case outcome? Dismissed. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, reporters flipping through papers, rushing to pull up articles from a decade ago. Colson's voice cut through the chaos. This wasn't just a bad traffic stop. This wasn't just racial profiling. This was a man who has been protected by the system for years. Shaq finally spoke again, his deep voice commanding silence. "I didn't speak up for me," he said, his hands folded in front of him. "I spoke up for every black man who was stopped and didn't have a camera recording. I spoke up for the ones who couldn't afford a lawyer, the ones who never got to tell their side of the story." He exhaled slowly. "This stops today." Across the city, in the dimly lit office of Brentwood's police commissioner, Raymond Briggs sat frozen, watching the press conference on his screen. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. This wasn't just a controversy anymore. This was a career-ending disaster. His phone rang. He already knew who it was. He picked up, his throat dry. "Briggs," the voice on the other end said, firm, emotionless. "Turn in your badge. You're done." Briggs gripped the phone tighter. "We can fix this," he started. You are done." A click. Silence. Briggs sat back in his chair, staring at the wall. For the first time in his career, he was the one being erased. Hours later, the Brentwood Police Department released a statement. Officer Raymond Briggs has been placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. They weren't calling it a firing. Not yet. They weren't admitting guilt, but it didn't matter. Briggs was out. And the city? The city was celebrating. That night, Shaq sat on the balcony of his apartment watching the city lights stretch into the horizon. The fight wasn't over. The system was still broken. There were still too many Briggses out there. Too many stories buried in manila folders that no one ever read. But today was a victory. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You won this round, O'Neill. But don't think this fight is over." Shaq stared at the screen, then slowly smiled. He set the phone down. The fight was just getting started. The sun had barely risen over Brentwood when Shaq arrived at City Hall. The air was thick with tension, but this time, it was different. This wasn't about protests, anger, or demands for revenge. This was about change. Inside, the conference room was filled with some of the most powerful people in the city. The mayor, the police commissioner, state legislators, civil rights advocates. Some of them had ignored the issue for years. Some had even benefited from the silence. But today, none of them could afford to look away. Shaq took his seat at the head of the long oak table, his lawyer David Colson beside him. Across from him sat Mayor Evelyn Grant, a woman who had built her career on playing the middle ground. Beside her, Police Commissioner Robert Hensley, the man who had once defended Briggs, now forced to explain why his department had protected a corrupt cop for so long. Shaq leaned forward, his massive hands folded on the table. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. "We're not here to talk about me," he said. "We're here to talk about fixing what let this happen in the first place." The room fell silent. Colson slid a stack of documents across the table. "This," he said, tapping the papers, "is a proposal for a new police accountability bill." The mayor raised an eyebrow. "And you expect us to—" "Yes," Shaq interrupted. "I do." The mayor pursed her lips. "These things take time, Shaquille." Shaq nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, that's what they said 60 years ago during the civil rights movement. These things take time. That's what they said when people were marching for their rights. That's what they said when unarmed black men kept getting killed and cops kept getting away with it." He exhaled sharply. "Tell me something, Mayor. How much time do you think people have left?" The room went dead silent. Colson picked up where Shaq left off. "This bill would make police misconduct reports public record. It would create an independent review board, outside of the department, to investigate cases like Briggs. It would strip pension benefits from officers found guilty of excessive force." The commissioner shifted uncomfortably. "We already have an internal review system." Shaq's stare was cold. "Yeah? And how many officers has it actually held accountable?" The commissioner had no answer. The mayor cleared her throat. "And what if we don't pass it?" Shaq smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then the protests continue. The cameras stay. And when election season rolls around, you explain to the people why you protected cops like Briggs instead of protecting them." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The mayor looked at Colson, then at the commissioner, then at the documents in front of her. She sighed. "We'll review it." Shaq nodded. "Do more than review it. Pass it." That same night, Brentwood's local news station aired an exclusive interview. It wasn't with Shaq. It wasn't with the mayor. It was with a man named Curtis Bell. He sat in a chair, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes weary. Across from him, the reporter leaned forward. "Tell us what happened," she said softly. Curtis swallowed hard. "It was 2015. I was leaving work, heading home. I had just bought my first car, a used Honda, but I was proud of it." His voice shook slightly as he continued. "I got pulled over. Officer said it was for a broken taillight. But when I got out to check, the light was fine." He took a deep breath. "Briggs made me get out anyway, searched my car. When I asked why, he shoved me against the hood and cuffed me." The reporter frowned. "What were you charged with?" Curtis let out a bitter laugh. "Nothing. They let me go after 2 hours. No explanation. No apology." He looked straight into the camera. "I filed a complaint. It got buried." The reporter's voice was steady. And why are you speaking out now? Curtis exhaled. Because for the first time, people are actually listening. While Curtis's interview aired, Officer Briggs sat in a dimly lit interrogation room. No badge, no gun, just a man whose power had finally been stripped away. Across from him sat two internal affairs investigators. One of them was holding a folder as thick as a law book. You know what this is, Ray? The first investigator asked. Briggs didn't answer. The investigator smirked. It's your career. Every complaint, every buried report, every abuse of power. The second investigator leaned forward. And now, thanks to the mayor's decision, it's all being made public. Briggs swallowed hard. You can't. We can, the investigator interrupted. And we have. A long silence stretched between them. Then, the investigator spoke again. You've got two choices, Briggs. Resign and disappear, or we arrest you for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and falsifying reports. Briggs's jaw clenched. He looked around the room as if searching for a way out. But there was none. His voice was barely above a whisper. Give me the paperwork. The next morning, Shaq walked through the rec center he had built years ago. It was busier than usual. Kids played basketball on the courts, parents watched from the sidelines, hope filling the air. Shaq stopped near the entrance, watching it all. A boy, the same one from the protest, the one who had shouted his name, ran up to him. Hey, Mr. Shaq, the kid said, his eyes bright. Did you win? Shaq smiled. It's not about winning, little man. He looked around at the kids playing, the families laughing. It's about making things better. The boy nodded. So, what happens now? Shaq knelt down, resting a massive hand on the kid's shoulder. Now, he said, we keep fighting. And this time, the whole world was watching. The city had changed. It wasn't overnight, and it wasn't perfect, but Brentwood felt different. The protests had quieted, but their echoes still lingered. The conversations that once got brushed aside were now impossible to ignore. And at the heart of it all stood Big Shaq, not as a victim, not just as a former athlete, but as a man who refused to let injustice define him. A month had passed since Briggs was forced to resign. The police accountability bill had moved through the city council faster than any legislation in Brentwood's recent history. The independent review board was being assembled. The people had spoken, and for once, the system had listened. But Shaq knew change couldn't stop there. Reforming the system wasn't just about removing bad cops. It was about building better ones. And that's where the next part of his plan came in. The press conference was held at Brentwood Community College. Cameras flashed as Shaq took the stage, standing in front of a banner that read, "The Shaquille O'Neal Future Leaders Scholarship, for those who choose to protect and serve with honor." The mayor was there. So was the police commissioner. But today, they weren't the ones in the spotlight. Shaq stepped up to the mic, looking out at the sea of young faces before him. "I spent my life fighting battles on the court," he said. "But the real fight, the fight for justice, for fairness, for change, that's played out every day in our streets, in our schools, in our police stations." He paused, scanning the crowd. "That's why I'm proud to announce the creation of a new scholarship program, one that will give young black men and women the opportunity to join law enforcement the right way, to be the change from the inside." A murmur spread through the audience. Journalists scrambled to write down every word. "This scholarship will cover full tuition, training, and mentorship for students who want to serve their communities with integrity. But it's not just about becoming a cop. It's about being the kind of officer who stands up when something isn't right. The kind who doesn't just wear a badge, but earns the trust behind it." The room erupted in applause. Shaq looked toward the back, where a young man, Dion, the same kid from the protest, stood wide-eyed, hanging onto every word. This was for kids like him. Kids who deserved to grow up believing that justice wasn't just a word, but a promise. A week later, Shaq sat behind the wheel of his custom black SUV, driving through the same neighborhood where it all began. He recognized the street instantly. The pristine sidewalks, the neatly trimmed hedges, the same stores, the same houses. But something was different. This time there was no patrol car trailing him, no flashing lights, no Officer Briggs waiting to pull him over. Instead, people were outside, waiting, watching. A small group had gathered, residents of the neighborhood, store owners, young kids standing on the sidewalk. Some held signs, some just stood there, watching as Shaq slowed to a stop. And then, someone started clapping. It spread one by one until the entire crowd was applauding. Shaq exhaled, stepping out of the car. A woman approached, the same woman who had filmed his arrest that day, the one in the green hoodie. She smiled, holding out her phone. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said. Shaq took the phone. On the screen was a new viral clip. Not of his arrest, not of the protests, but of a young black man being sworn in as one of Brentwood's newest police officers, a graduate of the first class of his scholarship program. Shaq smiled. This was the legacy. Not revenge, not anger, but building something better. As he turned to face the crowd, he saw Dion standing near the front. The kid grinned. "You did it," Mr. Shaq. Shaq knelt down, looking him in the eye. "Nah," he said. "We did." And for the first time since that fateful day, Shaq O'Neal walked through Brentwood's streets, not as a target, not as a victim, but as a man who had changed the city forever. Justice isn't just a moment, it's a movement. The system changes when people refuse to stay silent, when the truth is louder than the lies. Who holds power in your city? Who protects it? Who challenges it? The fight doesn't end with one victory. It ends when justice isn't a battle. It's a guarantee. So ask yourself, what are you doing to make that happen?